Okay, so the next thing we need to do here is to add some screw holes to these sliding dovetails. Now, there's a very important reason why I'm using screws rather than just glue, because a sliding dovetail is a very strong joint just on its own. The way that I have these fitted up, they'll hold themselves together with their own weight. So the screws are not really going to be doing much. What the screws are going to be doing is preventing wood movement in a direction that I don't want. So we all know that when you try and slide wood on wood with glue in between them, what happens is the air gets forced out between that glue and those pieces get kind of suctioned together. And that's exactly what would happen if I tried to do that in this circumstance. So the solution there would just be to put glue on one end, which I'm still going to do. But this also brings up the second reason, is that I want to avoid wood movement in a direction that I don't want. So the reason we put our drawer support panels in this orientation with the grain running vertically here is because wood movement is going to happen over the width of this thing. So this panel is going to, as it expands and contracts, it's going to expand and contract widthwise, which won't affect the overall fitting of our drawers. If we're going to do it the other way and have our grain going across here, it would expand and contract vertically, pushing our frames up and down, and then the height between our drawers would change, and it would affect the overall look and function of the dresser. So that's why you put your panels in this way. Now what I want to try and avoid is I want to make sure that my panel in the front stays where I set it. And so what I'm going to do when I install these panels is I'm going to leave this front edge just past the front edge of all our frames. That way I can come back in, clean it up with a hand plane, and it'll look really clean, really good. And I want to make sure that that front edge stays perfectly in line with the front edge of all those frames. So how it's going to work is I'm going to take a screw, put it in right near the front, basically 2 to 3 inches in from the front. And I want to make sure that I'm not in this white oak section because we don't have a good connection in the frame on that white oak section. So we're going to make sure we're in that back maple area. So this screw in the front is going to be very important because it's going to be a perfectly fitted screw. So all that means is I'm going to drill a hole, countersink that hole, and this screw is going to prevent this frame from really expanding and contracting outward. Then on the back end of this panel, there will be a second screw, but it'll be a little bit different because rather than just drilling a simple hole, it's going to be an elongated hole. So that'll allow this screw to move lengthwise on this panel here. Or not lengthwise in the panel, but lengthwise on the frame. Okay, so we're at the point now where we're ready to glue this thing up. So anytime right before you're doing a glue up, I always recommend doing a final dry assembly. Whether you've made any changes to your piece since the last time you had it dry assembled, or if you've just left it for a few hours, always do a dry assembly right before you glue it up. There's 2 big reasons for this. For one, it'll let you just do a final check, make sure you've got all your components where they need to be, everything's fitting up nicely. If you've left your pieces sitting overnight or something may have moved, something may have changed since the last time you had it dry assembled, so you may need to make some more minor changes before you can actually glue this thing up. The other reason for this is it gives you a little bit of practice, lets you figure out how you actually are going to put this thing together when you are on the clock and you have that glue starting to dry. And so by doing this dry assembly, I've now figured out the way that I'm going to do this. It's actually going to be super easy and probably one of the least stressful big glue ups I've ever done. So what I'm going to do is rather than putting the glue on the tenons like I normally do, I'm going to put glue inside the mortises. Now the benefit of this is that I'm not going to end up rubbing glue all over the inside of my legs as I'm trying to position these long frames into the mortises. It is going to be a little bit challenging to get good glue surface in those mortises, but if I spend a little bit of time making sure that those are all have a good amount of glue in them and are well covered, it's going to be a hell of a lot easier to clean this thing up later on and just kind of prevent any nightmares of tenons getting stuck in places they're not supposed to get stuck in. so with the wide dresser glued up now, we can start looking back at the tall dresser. So there's two major mistakes on the tall dresser that I have to deal with before I can glue it up. So the first one is I have to fill the holes. So if we look back at my initial design, I had a whole bunch of frames filling up the drawer area of the left-hand side of the tall dresser. And I basically just had frames going between each level of drawers. And I realize now that that's totally useless. So what I need to go through and do now is fill the mortise holes that I cut into the sides. So I already did this on the wide dresser. I didn't show it just because I wanted to make sure that the method was going to work before I went through and did it. And it worked out really well. And so using my drum sander, I thinned down a piece pretty precisely to fit into each of the mortises. Then I cut them down to length so that when we fit them into each of these mortises, we're going to have this long grain showing rather than having like a piece of end grain showing. Now, realistically, if you want to try and get really fancy with this, you could use a piece of 8/4 stock and thin it down the long way and try and fit your grain in vertically. That would be the best way to hide these, but I'm not really trying to hide them particularly. I just want to fill them to make sure that they're more structurally sound. Again, these mortises are on the inside of these pieces behind drawers, so you're never really going to notice them. Now, the other part of filling these mortises is the dowel holes that I've already drilled in the front. And so if we look at the side here, on this front edge, I've already pre-drilled all of the dowel holes. So we've got these dowel holes poking through here that are going to be fairly obvious in the final piece. Now, one option would be go through and fill them with a plug. Now, the downside is that these are 3/16 holes, and the smallest plug cutter you can buy is 1/4 of an inch. Now, the smallest plugger that I own is 5/16 of an inch. So that would mean that if I wanted to use that one, I'd have to go through and enlarge each of these holes to 5/16 of an inch. And so although plug cutting is a good way to fill a hole, it doesn't really work out when you're going from a really small, barely noticeable hole and enlarging it. Because you can see on this piece that I tested on here, just by the nature of putting in the plug cutters, I did 5 here. 4 of them came out really nicely. 1 of them came out a little bit crooked. And these were I really took my time to try and get these in nice and square and clean them up with the hand plane and all that. They don't really look that good. They're very obvious that you fix something, and the hole is about twice as big as the one that's already in here. And so on here, rather than trying to make this look like a mistake that I'm trying to fix, I'm trying to make it look intentional. So what I'm going to do is, rather than trying to hide it with like white oak dowel or something, I'm going to put a piece of walnut dowel in there. That's really not going to do anything, just other than fill this hole with a piece of walnut. Because the trick here is then it looks intentional. And because each of these holes is still going to be centered right on the intersection of those two drawers, so our drawers are going to line up right on that dowel point there, it's going to look like it was planned out that way. It's going to look like it's there for a reason. Alright, and so off camera I got together all of the materials needed to put together this new side panel. So I've got my 2 breadboard end pieces. The panel is also all flattened up, cut to length, it's all squared up, it's ready to go. So we're ready to just start working on the breadboard ends here. So typically what you'd do with breadboard ends is you'd start by just cutting a 1/4 inch deep groove on here. Then you'd go in and use the mortiser or chisels or whatever and cut mortises going down in about 3 places. And so that method is very well suited to making larger panels anytime you're doing, really long breadboard ends. Whereas here, I'm only doing a 3/4 inch long tenon on this panel. So there's no point really going in and adding these tenons that are only going to be 3/4 of an inch long. And so all I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut a 3/4 inch deep groove into my breadboard end piece, mount it on the end there. We'll still put in our dowels and all that with the proper room for movement, and it'll just be a little bit easier. Okay, so this panel is all kinds of stupid at the moment. So basically what's happened is that all of my measurements are just completely off. It's still gonna work out just fine, just my measurements are just stupid at the moment. And so first off is the length. When I was doing the length, the two pieces I grabbed were leftovers from some of the other pieces that we used. So they're 2.5 inches. When I was making the plan for this panel, I planned around 2-inch pieces. So that extra ½ inch in each of those pieces that I grabbed for the ends just adds in and makes this thing 26 inches long when I need a 25-inch long panel. So not a big thing to deal with. And so the only minor problems that we have is on the width is I should have been going for 17.5, but in reality I went for 17 just because obviously some number got mixed up somewhere. And so luckily that we still have plenty of enough holding strength in there. We still have a solid 1/4 inch tenon going down the whole length of this panel, holding it into the sides. So it's going to be plenty strong enough. This isn't really a load bearing panel. It's just going to support the weight of a couple different shelves. But other than that, there's not going to be anything super heavy stored in here. Alright, so the last thing we're going to do before we glue up the tall dresser here is just add in a couple of pocket hole screws. Now again, I'm resorting to pocket hole screws, and I'm trying to use them in the way that they're designed to be used, because they're really the only form of joinery that I can use here. The traditional form of joinery that would do the same thing as these pocket hole screws would be a sliding dovetail. But what that would mean would be putting a sliding dovetail across the whole width of my side panel there. And there really is not a good, accurate way to do that at this point in time. So we're just going to put 3 little pocket hole screws in here, and what that'll do is it'll just help prevent some of that wood movement.